On Sunday, that same day, two disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about everything that had happened. While they were discussing these things, Jesus himself joined them on their journey, but they did not recognize him.
He asked them, "What are you talking about as you walk along?" The disciples stopped, their faces dark with sorrow. "Are you the only one in all Jerusalem who does not know what terrible injustice happened there these days?" And they told him about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, powerful in deeds and words, and how he was handed over by religious leaders and sentenced to death and crucified. And we all hoped he was the one to rescue Israel.
Then Jesus said to them, "O you foolish and slow of heart, is it so difficult to believe to prophets? Wasn't it inevitable for the Christ to suffer?" And then he interpreted for them the things written about him in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets.
When they came to Emmaus, he wanted to walk on, but the disciples urged him, saying, "Stay with us. It's nearly evening, and the day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them, and at the table he took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them.
Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, but he disappeared from their sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he talked to us, opening to us the scriptures?" They got up right then and returned to Jerusalem to be again with the apostles and their companions. I love this story, friends. Roman philosopher Sallustius wrote in the 4th century about myths. Now these things never happened, but always are. It is a marvelous description of this story of two disciples going to Emmaus. It is my most beloved resurrection story exactly for that reason. All biblical scholars whom I respect and like are unanimous that this story never happened as it is recorded. But I also know that it is still happening. We all are invited to experience it ourselves. We all are invited to live it out. We all are invited to participate and make it happen in our world. So I will now divide this sermon into two parts. Firstly, and most often, this story is perceived as a deep and meaningful outline of our Christian worship. On the Easter Sunday, two disciples travel to Emmaus, and they are joined by a third fellow traveler that constitutes the minimal number for worship. Wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in Jesus' name, and it can easily be Jesus himself making that number. Their worship starts with confessing their pain, their confusion, their disappointment. At times, it almost has qualities of hymnic lament. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. And this painful reality of the world is addressed in the sermon. Still unrecognized, Jesus is explaining the scriptures. All the prophets and people of God, didn't they suffer? But it did not mean defeat. It was a divine invitation to resist, to overcome fear and death with love and with life. Later, they would remember that this sermon set their hearts alight. It was not. The turning point, though, that came later. The pivotal point came with what we can call Eucharist, the Lord's table. When the stranger took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. And at that moment of shared sacred meal, their eyes were finally opened. When we share food and eat together, we meet with the resurrected, and the world is changed and turned upside down. Or should we rather say downside up? And for that reason, at that moment, they run out to share this miracle, this mystery, and to seek community. So this is the sacramental, liturgical, worshipful interpretation of this parable about Jesus. Every communion Sunday, we are pulled into this story. We participate in this resurrection story. That's why so many ministers would love to celebrate communion every Sunday. It makes sense exactly for this reason. But I believe that we need to go and make another step. Go one more journey. It is more than just liturgy and worship what is in front of us. We are all pulled into this resurrection story totally, completely. All our faith and all our lives are embraced and enveloped in this story. Just look at it and put it into our own perspective and into our own context. We all start broken, fragmented, lost people, somehow running away from Jerusalem, from pain and disappointment. And it is all right to feel that way, and it is all right to voice our pain. It is definitely better than some kind of an Pollyannish cheap optimism. Because if we are honest with our feelings, that enables us to take that pain, our own or the pain of the world, seriously, and to allow God to address it through the scriptures, through the word of God, to talk to us in that situation. Karl Barth is taught, and I think that he even wrote that he would have on his desk, on one side newspaper and on the other side a Bible. And we can take it again one step further. Political scientists analyze news, and fundamentalists, they pray over the Bible. What I see in this story is Jesus asks us to pray over newspapers and analyze the Bible. Then they will start talking to one another, will recognize that the pain is an inherent part of this world. It should not be justified, but should be reckoned with and overcome with love and with hope. And it sets our hearts alight. Hearts are not a symbol of some soft, mushy feelings. No. For Hebrew people and for Jesus and for Luke, who wrote this story, they are seed of resolve, dedication, and courage. And that is where it leads us next. And it offers us also a new interpretation of communion. Because faith is never theoretical, never only intellectual, never only emotional or spiritual for that matter. It leads into action. And when the strangers gives them signs of walking on, they invite him, almost force him, welcoming a stranger into their home. Just like we are inviting strangers into our homes or into our spiritual home or into our church, like welcoming refugees from Syria and from Afghanistan, or supporting asylum seekers. It leads into sharing food just like we do at our Thursday meal program. And even specifically in the midst of this dangerous pandemic, volunteers are still coming there on Thursdays and sharing the food. Or when we opened a month and a half ago our Blue Room as a sanctuary for a frightened family from Harlem, and I witnessed how our loving but often gruff Frank was transformed. He was melting in front of my eyes into a gently caring Frank. In action of defiant and loving faith, that is the eye-opening moment, and lives are transformed, touched by resurrection. Because we realize, we know we are not sharing our resources. We all are sharing God's abundant grace. And in the hungry, and in the naked, in those in prisons, and in the refugees, in the homeless, and those who are strangers, in the sick and in the dying, we are meeting our resurrected Lord. The simplest of meals is transformed into the feast of victory. And we all are resurrection people. Not any longer fragmented and separated and distant, but brought together in spirit and with shared purpose. We might be separated by necessity of the social or physical distancing, but that is only temporarily. It will pass. And now even it cannot stop us from sharing at one special table disseminated throughout Upper West Side and far beyond. And soon we'll be able again to rush together and to unite in sharing God's abundance and resurrected life. That is also a task for us, to continue recognizing that incognito Lord in the suffering of this world. And, like those two disciples, rush together to unite, to fight against fragmentation. There'll be a great need after this is all over for uniting, creating a spiritual garden where people will meet together and go strive for something better than what we are living right now, and definitely better than what preceded this situation. That is how we proceed from fear and mourning into understanding, resolve, and resurrected life. With our hearts, that is, resolve, determination, and energy ablaze, and with our eyes open. Amen.